"Please help me," shouts a bedridden woman, begging the thief who broke into her house. When her husband arrives, he is shocked. Before the story begins, comment below which city you're watching this video from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Enjoy the story, everyone. The water sprayed from the pressure washer, creating a rainbow in the early morning Sacramento sun. Frank Bennett wiped the sweat from his brow, his calloused hands a testament to the years he'd spent at Riverside Car Wash. At 42, his sturdy frame still moved with purpose, though the lines around his eyes had deepened significantly over the past year. "Looking good, Mr. Harrington," Frank called out, handing the keys to the gleaming SUV back to its owner, a regular customer who worked as an executive chef at one of Sacramento's upscale restaurants. "Thanks, Frank. You always do a great job." Richard Harrington slipped him an extra $20 bill. "How's that boy of yours doing?" Frank's smile faltered just slightly. "He's hanging in there. Thanks for asking." As Mr. Harrington drove away, Frank pocketed the tip with a mixture of gratitude and resignation. Every extra dollar helped, but it was nowhere near enough. Nothing was ever enough these days. "Frank, order up on Bay 3, his boss, Jerry, called out. "On it," he replied, moving to the next vehicle. As he methodically worked through the afternoon, Frank's mind drifted to where it always did, to his 5-year-old son, Gabe, and to the dreams he'd once had for himself that now seemed as distant as the stars. Dreams of crisp white chef coats, of creating culinary masterpieces, of hearing diners' murmurs of appreciation as they savored his creations. He'd been on track once. Culinary school applications filled out, even a partial scholarship secured. Then came the unexpected pregnancy with his ex-girlfriend, Melissa, and priorities shifted. He'd chosen responsibility over dreams, a decision he never regretted, despite Melissa abandoning them both just 2 years after Gabe was born. What he hadn't anticipated was how cruelly fate would test his resolve when Gabe was diagnosed with juvenile chronic neuropathy at age 3. The sun was setting by the time Frank clocked out. He walked to his beat-up 2005 Honda Civic, the car that refused to die despite needing repairs Frank couldn't afford to make. He stopped at Mrs. Wilson's house, an elderly neighbor who watched Gabe after preschool. "He's been asking for you," Mrs. Wilson said softly as she opened the door. "He's had a rough afternoon. The pain was pretty bad around 4 o'clock, but I gave him his medicine like you showed me. He's been watching cartoons since then. Thank you for everything, Mrs. Wilson." Frank pressed $50 into her hand, money he didn't have to spare, but she deserved every penny and more for her kindness. "Frank," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "I noticed the bottle is almost empty. Do you have a refill ready?" He swallowed hard, nodding with false confidence. "Got it covered," he lied. Inside, he found Gabe curled up on the couch, his small body seeming even tinier against the floral cushions. The boy's eyes lit up when he saw his father. "Daddy?" Despite his fatigue, Gabe's smile was radiant. "Hey, buddy." Frank scooped him up gently, always mindful of his son's sensitivity to touch. "How about we get you home and have some mac and cheese tonight? With hot dogs cut up in it?" Gabe asked hopefully. "You bet. The works for my little man." The drive home was short, just 10 minutes to their modest 2-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood of Sacramento. Frank carried Gabe inside, settling him at the kitchen table with a coloring book while he prepared dinner. As the water boiled, Frank discreetly checked the medicine cabinet. Mrs. Wilson was right. There were only 3 pills left of Gabe's prescription. 3 days' worth of relief from the debilitating pain that could leave his son screaming in agony. The specialized medication cost $100 to $200 for a 30-day supply, and insurance only covered a fraction of it. His next paycheck wouldn't arrive for 2 weeks, and it was already spoken for. Rent, utilities, food. Frank's hand trembled as he stirred the macaroni. He'd tried everything legitimate: payment plans with the pharmacy, assistance programs, overtime at work, selling his possessions. He'd even asked Jerry for an advance, but the car wash was struggling too in the economic downturn. After tucking Gabe into bed later that night, Frank sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. On the table lay past-due medical bills, a final notice for the electricity, and a calendar marked with Gabe's doctor appointments. Next to these sat a notebook where Frank had been planning, no, fantasizing, about opening his own food truck someday. Pages filled with menu ideas, cost projections and sketches of a logo, Frank's Fusion Flavors. He flipped through the notebook, stopping at a recipe he'd created for a California Korean fusion taco that had won a local amateur cooking contest 3 years ago. The prize had been $500, enough for exactly 2 weeks of Gabe's medication back then, before the price increases. His phone buzzed with a text from his cousin. "Still got that security job if you want it. Night shift. Cash under table. LMK." Frank had turned it down before. The job involved guarding an unmarked warehouse in a sketchy part of town. But now, staring at those 3 remaining pills in the bottle, desperation clawed at his throat. He was about to text back when he heard a small distressed sound from Gabe's room. Frank rushed in to find his son whimpering in his sleep, his little face contorted in pain even in dreams. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Frank gently stroked Gabe's hair until he settled. "I promise I'll fix this," he whispered, though Gabe couldn't hear him. "I'll find a way." Back in the kitchen, Frank opened his laptop and searched local pawn shops, mentally cataloging what little of value he still owned. His gaze drifted to the window, out towards the affluent neighborhood of River Park, just a few miles away. Houses where people had more than they needed. Houses where a single item might be worth enough to keep Gabe comfortable for months. Houses where, rumor had it, wealthy residents often traveled for weeks at a time, leaving their homes sitting empty. Frank closed the laptop, his breathing shallow. He'd never stolen anything in his life. The very thought made him sick with shame. But as he looked at his son's medicine bottle, with its 3 remaining pills, a desperate clarity washed over him. Sometimes a man had to choose between his morals and his child's suffering. And for Frank, there was no choice at all. He picked up his phone and deleted his cousin's text. Whatever he did next, he would do alone. No one else would bear the burden of his decisions or the weight of his conscience. 3 days. He had 3 days to find a solution before Gabe would be in unbearable pain again. Frank opened the window, letting the cool night air flow in. Across the city, in neighborhoods where people worried about stock portfolios instead of survival, houses sat unoccupied and full of valuables. Houses with alarm systems he knew nothing about, with potential dangers he couldn't anticipate. But worse than all those risks was the vision of Gabe writhing in pain, begging for relief that Frank couldn't provide. That image steeled his resolve more than any amount of planning could have. Tomorrow he would drive through River Park after work, just to look, just to see, just to consider the unthinkable as it slowly transformed into his only option. 3 miles away, in a sprawling Mediterranean-style home in River Park, Emma van der Meer lay motionless in her king-sized bed. The curtains remained drawn, casting the master bedroom in perpetual twilight despite the afternoon sun outside. The silence in the house was absolute, broken only by the occasional sound of her labored breathing. At 35, Emma was a shadow of the vibrant woman who had arrived in California 4 years earlier. Her once lustrous blonde hair was gone, replaced by a silk scarf that covered her bare scalp. Her high cheekbones now jutted prominently from a face hollowed by illness and chemotherapy. The double mastectomy had left her feeling less than whole, and the surgical scars were still tender beneath her nightgown. She stared at the glass of water on her bedside table. It had been there for 2 days, just out of reach. Her parched lips and throat begged for relief, but she lacked the strength to bridge the 12 inches between her trembling hand and salvation. The irony wasn't lost on her, dying of thirst while surrounded by luxury. 3 days had passed since Lucas, her husband of 3 years, had walked out the door with a weekend bag and a casual wave. "Just going to meet some friends at Tahoe," he'd said, not quite meeting her eyes. "You'll be fine until Monday. I've left food in the fridge." Emma had known even then that he wasn't planning to return on Monday. The phone call she had overheard the night before had confirmed what she'd suspected for months. Lucas was waiting for her to die. "She won't last much longer," he had whispered to someone, his voice drifting up the stairs as Emma lay awake. "The doctors gave her weeks, maybe a month. Then we can finally move on with our lives." The devastating betrayal hurt far worse than the cancer that was consuming her body. Lucas Hargrove, the handsome Spanish teacher who had swept her off her feet, who had promised to love her in sickness and in health, was now counting the days until her death would free him. They had met at the private language school, where Emma taught English to business executives. Her natural flair for languages She spoke Dutch, English, German, and was learning Spanish, had made her popular with students and staff alike. Lucas, with his charismatic smile and passionate teaching style, had seemed like the perfect match. Their courtship had been a whirlwind. Weekends exploring California's wine country, romantic dinners at exclusive restaurants, spontaneous drives up the coast. Within 6 months, Lucas had proposed, presenting her with a diamond ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "In my family, we only give this ring when we've found our forever," he'd told her. Forever, it seemed, had an expiration date. Emma's eyes drifted to the photos on the wall. Their wedding in Napa Valley, honeymoon in Barcelona, the life they'd built in this beautiful home in Sacramento. All an illusion that had shattered the moment the doctor had said the word malignant. She remembered Lucas's face as the oncologist explained the aggressive treatment plan, the shock, followed by something else. Something that, at the time, she had mistaken for concern, but now recognized as calculation. The first surgery had been bearable. Lucas had been there, if somewhat distant. By the second operation, he had started finding excuses to be elsewhere: conferences, school functions, overnight trips to visit a sick relative. The chemotherapy sessions she had attended alone, taking Ubers to and from the hospital, because Lucas was suddenly swamped with work. Her friends had noticed the change in him, though they'd tried to be gentle about it. Men sometimes struggle with illness, her friend Sophia had suggested delicately. He'll come around. But he hadn't come around. Instead, he'd gradually distanced himself, spending less and less time at home. The home that Emma now realized with bitter clarity was entirely in his name, a detail she'd overlooked when they'd purchased it, touched by his insistence that he wanted to provide for her. The house phone rang, its shrill tone piercing the silence. Emma couldn't reach it from the bed, and her cell phone had died days ago. Lucas had taken the charger from her bedside table, claiming he needed it for a trip. Another small cruelty in what had become a campaign of neglect. The ringing stopped, and the answering machine picked up. "Emma, it's Dr. Patel. I'm concerned that you've missed your last 2 appointments. Please call the office as soon as possible to reschedule." Tears slid down Emma's hollow cheeks. Dr. Patel had been the one constant through this nightmare, the oncologist whose compassionate care had given her hope even when the prognosis was grim. Lucas had been supposed to drive her to those appointments, but he'd forgotten, leaving her too weak to arrange alternative transportation. As darkness fell, Emma drifted in and out of consciousness. Memories floated through her mind, her childhood in Amsterdam, the canals freezing in winter, skating with her father while her mother prepared hot chocolate, the university years in England where she'd first discovered her love for teaching, the fateful vacation to California that had made her fall in love with American optimism and openness. How eagerly she had embraced this new life, this new country. How naively she had trusted Lucas, dismissing the red flags. His vague answers about his past, his reluctance to introduce her to his family, his careful steering of their social circle to include only his approved friends. A noise from downstairs startled her, fully awake. Emma strained to listen. Lucas wouldn't be back yet. It was only Friday. The sound came again, a door opening, then quietly closing. Footsteps, hesitant and unfamiliar. Fear gripped her. She was completely defenseless. The home security system that Lucas had installed with such fanfare required a code to activate, a code he had never shared with her. Her phone was dead. The neighbors on either side were away on summer vacations. The footsteps were coming up the stairs now. Emma tried to call out, to warn the intruder that the house was occupied, but her parched throat produced only a hoarse whisper. Her heart raced painfully in her chest as the bedroom door slowly opened. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, medium height with broad shoulders. Not Lucas, whose tall, lean frame she would have recognized instantly. The stranger hesitated, clearly surprised to find someone home. Emma tried again to speak, managing only a raspy, "Please, help." The man jumped at the sound, nearly dropping the flashlight he held. The beam swung wildly before settling on her face. Emma blinked against the sudden brightness, unable to see the intruder's expression. "Oh my God," a deep voice breathed. The flashlight lowered, and Emma caught a glimpse of a weathered face, wide eyes, and a day's growth of beard. I didn't know anyone was here." "Water," Emma whispered, gesturing weakly toward the glass. To her surprise, The man approached cautiously. He picked up the glass, noticed it was empty, and disappeared into the ensuite bathroom. Emma heard water running, and moments later he returned, holding the glass to her lips with unexpected gentleness. The cool water was bliss against her parched throat. Emma drank greedily, some spilling down her chin, which the stranger awkwardly dabbed away with the sleeve of his jacket. "Thank you," she managed, her voice slightly stronger. The man stood uncomfortably beside the bed, clearly torn between fleeing and concern for the invalid he'd discovered. "Are you alone here?" he asked finally. Emma nodded. "My husband left me." The simple words carried the weight of all Lucas's betrayal. The stranger shifted, glancing around the room, taking in the medical supplies, the prescription bottles, the hospital bed disguised with expensive linens. "How long have you been alone?" he asked, his voice rough with what sounded like reluctant compassion. 3 days, Emma replied. "Maybe 4. I lose track." He swore under his breath, running a hand through his short dark hair. "You need a hospital." "No insurance," Emma said bitterly. "Lucas cancelled it last month. Said it was a mistake with the payments." She knew now it had been deliberate, one more step in ensuring her quiet, unobtrusive exit from his life. The man paced the room, clearly agitated. Emma could see him more clearly now, mid-40s perhaps, dressed in jeans and a faded work shirt, hands calloused and stained with what looked like automotive grease. Not the polished criminal she might have imagined, but a working man who seemed as out of place in her bedroom as a wolf in a china shop. "I'm going to get you something to eat," he said abruptly, setting down the flashlight on the bedside table. "Then we'll figure something out." Before Emma could respond, he was gone, his footsteps retreating downstairs. She heard cabinets opening and closing in the kitchen, the sound of the refrigerator, the microwave beeping. Emma closed her eyes, wondering if she was hallucinating. Perhaps this strange guardian angel was a fever dream, a product of dehydration and desperation. But when the smell of chicken soup reached her nostrils, followed by the sound of returning footsteps, she knew he was real. The stranger returned with a tray bearing a bowl of soup, more water and some crackers. He set it down and helped Emma to sit up, arranging pillows behind her with awkward care. "I'm Frank," he said finally, as if deciding that names were necessary now that he was serving soup rather than burglarizing. "Emma," she replied, allowing him to guide a spoonful of soup to her lips. As the warm broth revived her, Emma studied her unlikely rescuer. There was kindness in his eyes, she decided, but also a desperate edge that matched her own circumstances. A good man in a bad situation, she recognized the type. What she couldn't know was that Frank Bennett had come to her house that night, prepared to cross a moral line he'd never thought he would cross, only to find himself drawn into a situation far more complicated than a simple burglary. Just as she couldn't know that this strange intersection of their broken lives would become the crossroads where both might find redemption. Frank's hands shook as he guided the spoon to Emma's lips. What had started as a desperate plan to find something valuable to sell had turned into, whatever this was, he certainly hadn't expected to find a dying woman abandoned in the master bedroom of what he'd thought was an empty house. "When did you last eat?" he asked, watching her struggle to swallow even the thin broth. "Tuesday, I think," Emma replied weakly. "Lucas left some sandwiches, but they were on the kitchen counter. I couldn't get downstairs." Frank felt a surge of anger towards this Lucas character. "Your husband left you alone like this, knowing you couldn't get out of bed?" Emma's eyes, still remarkably blue despite her pallor, filled with tears. "He's waiting for me to die," she whispered. "It's inconvenient for him, my illness." Frank set the soup bowl down, momentarily speechless. He'd been prepared to commit a crime tonight out of desperation to help his son. But abandoning a sick spouse to die alone? That was a level of cruelty he couldn't comprehend. "I'm calling an ambulance," he said firmly, reaching for his phone. Emma's hand shot out with surprising strength, gripping his wrist. "Please don't. Without insurance, they'll just stabilize me and send me home. Or worse, admit me and saddle me with bills I can never pay." She released his arm, the brief exertion leaving her breathing heavily. "I'd rather die here than in debt." Frank ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble against his palm. He'd skipped shaving that morning, an unconscious preparation for what he'd planned to do tonight. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd come here to steal, only to find someone with even less than he had. "What kind of cancer?" he asked quietly. "Breast. stage 3 when they found it. I had a double mastectomy, but it had already spread to my lymph nodes. Emma tugged self-consciously at the scarf covering her head. The chemo was working, but I missed my last 3 treatments because Lucas kept forgetting to take me. Frank's jaw tightened. He'd known men who walked out on their families. His ex had done it to him and Gabe, after all. But to systematically sabotage someone's cancer treatment, that was beyond abandonment. It was something far more sinister. Where is he now? Lake Tahoe, supposedly. With friends. Emma's bitter air quotes made it clear what she thought of these friends. He's not coming back. Not until it's over. Frank stood abruptly and paced the room, trying to think. The responsible thing would be to call emergency services, let them handle it. He could slip away before they arrived. No one would ever know he'd been here. But then, what would happen to Emma? And what would happen to Gabe when his medication ran out? I need to make a call, he said, stepping into the hallway. Mrs. Wilson answered on the 3rd ring, her voice thick with sleep. Frank? Is everything all right? Is it Gabe? Gabe's fine, Mrs. Wilson. I'm sorry to wake you, but I need a huge favor. Frank hesitated, then plunged ahead. I'm going to be late tonight. There's an emergency with a friend. Could Gabe stay with you until morning? I'll make it up to you, I promise. The elderly woman's voice softened. Of course, dear. Gabe's welcome any time, you know that. He's sleeping peacefully right now. Take care of your friend. Frank thanked her profusely before hanging up. Friend. The word felt strange when applied to the skeletal woman in the next room, a woman whose house he'd broken into less than an hour ago. But somehow it also felt right. He returned to the bedroom, decision made. I'm taking you to my place, he announced. It's not much, but it's clean, and my neighbor is a retired nurse. She can help look after you while I'm at work. Emma stared at him in disbelief. You'd do that for a stranger? Frank shrugged, feeling self-conscious. It's the right thing to do. Says the man who broke into my house, Emma observed, a ghost of a smile playing on her cracked lips. Frank had the grace to look embarrassed. Yeah, well, I've had a rough week. He didn't elaborate, and Emma didn't press. There was a tacit understanding between them. 2 souls at their lowest point, recognizing something familiar in each other's desperation. Can you walk at all? He asked. Emma shook her head. Not without help, and I'll need some clothes. The next 20 minutes were awkward, as Frank helped Emma into a pair of sweatpants and a loose sweater he found in her closet. He kept his eyes averted as much as possible while supporting her frail body. Emma said nothing about his obvious discomfort, focusing instead on the monumental effort of dressing herself. There's a wheelchair in the garage, she told him once she was dressed. Lucas got it when I started chemo. Before he... She trailed off, not needing to complete the thought. Frank located the wheelchair and carefully carried Emma downstairs, setting her in it with a gentleness that belied his calloused hands. He packed a bag with her medications, some clothes, toiletries, and the framed photo of a smiling older couple she pointed out on the nightstand. My parents, she explained. They died in a car accident 2 years ago, just before my diagnosis. Frank nodded, adding the photo to the bag. Anything else you need? Emma looked around the luxurious house that had become her prison. Just one thing, she said, pointing to a jewelry box on the dresser. The blue velvet pouch inside. It's my grandmother's jewelry. Family heirlooms. Frank retrieved the pouch, surprised by its weight. He handed it to Emma, who clutched it to her chest like a lifeline. Ready? He asked. She nodded, and Frank wheeled her out to his car, grateful for the late hour that meant no neighbors were likely to witness him essentially kidnapping a woman from her home. He helped her into the passenger seat, folded the wheelchair into his trunk, and slid behind the wheel. As they drove away from River Park, Emma stared out the window at the receding silhouette of her house. I never thought I'd leave like this, she murmured. Frank glanced at her. You can always go back. Once you're stronger. Emma shook her head. There's nothing there for me anymore. They drove in silence through the sleeping city. Frank's mind raced with practical concerns. Where would she sleep? What would he tell Gabe? How would he afford to feed another person when he was already struggling? But beneath these worries ran a current of something unfamiliar, a sense that perhaps this strange turn of events was somehow meant to be. Not that Frank was normally given to such thoughts. Life had taught him that coincidences were rarely meaningful, and that fortune rarely favored the desperate. They arrived at his apartment building shortly before midnight. It was a modest complex, clean but showing its age in peeling paint and cracked sidewalks. Frank helped Emma into the wheelchair and navigated the ramp that had been installed for an elderly resident who had long since moved out. His second-floor apartment was accessible by a service elevator that smelled faintly of cleaning products. Frank felt a flush of embarrassment as he unlocked his door, acutely aware of how humble his home would appear to someone who lived in River Park. "It's not much," he said apologetically as he wheeled Emma inside. The apartment was small but meticulously tidy. The living room doubled as a dining area, with a worn couch facing a small television and a round table with 3 mismatched chairs in the corner. The kitchen was visible through a pass-through window, its appliances dated but clean. A short hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. "It's lovely," Emma said sincerely. There was something about the space that felt instantly welcoming. Colourful children's artwork taped to the refrigerator, a handmade quilt draped over the couch, family photos clustered on a bookshelf. It felt lived in, loved. "You can take my room," Frank said, wheeling her toward the hallway. "I'll sleep on the couch." Emma started to protest, but Frank shook his head. "You need a proper bed. It's non-negotiable." He showed her to a spartanly furnished bedroom with a double bed, a dresser, and a nightstand. Unlike the rest of the apartment, there were no personal touches here. No photos, no artwork, no books. It was a room for sleeping, nothing more. Frank helped Emma transfer from the wheelchair to the bed, then busied himself putting her medications on the nightstand and hanging a few of her clothes in the closet. "There's someone else here," Emma observed softly. "I saw the children's drawings." Frank nodded. "My son Gabe, he's 5, he's staying with my neighbor tonight." He hesitated, then added, "He's sick. That's why I was at your house tonight. I needed money for his medication." There it was, the confession he hadn't planned to make. But somehow, in the quiet of his bedroom with this woman who had been abandoned to die, honesty seemed the only possible choice. Emma didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was gentle. "What's wrong with him?" "Juvenile chronic neuropathy. It's rare, causes severe pain episodes." Frank's hands clenched involuntarily. "The medication is expensive. Insurance only covers part of it." Emma nodded, understanding blooming in her eyes. 2 people pushed to extremes by illness and medical costs. It created a strange bond between them. "I should let you rest," Frank said, moving toward the door. "Bathrooms across the hall if you need it. I'll be on the couch if you need anything during the night." "Frank," Emma called as he reached the doorway. He turned back. "Thank you for not leaving me there." He nodded once, uncomfortable with gratitude for what seemed like basic human decency. "Try to get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll figure out next steps." As he closed the door, Frank wondered what exactly those next steps might be. He had no plan, no resources, and now 2 vulnerable people depending on him. But for the first time in months, he didn't feel quite so alone in his struggle. On the coffee table in the living room, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his cousin. "Last chance on that security job. Boss says position filled after tonight." Frank stared at the message for a long moment before typing a response. "Can't do it." Something came up. He settled onto the couch, pulling the spare blanket over himself. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for tonight he'd chosen a different path, one that felt strangely right despite the uncertainty it promised. 1 year later, the aroma of roasting garlic and fresh herbs filled the small commercial kitchen as Frank expertly flipped a pan of sautéing vegetables. The rhythmic chopping of his sous chef, Marco, created a culinary percussion in the background. "Order up," Frank called, sliding a plate of his signature California Korean fusion tacos onto the pass. "Table 7. Lily, their lead server, whisked the dish away with a smile. "They're going to love these. The couple at table 9 wants to know if the chef will come out after they finish their meal." Frank nodded, already focused on the next order. "Tell them I'll stop by." It still felt surreal. Frank's Fusion Kitchen, a small but thriving restaurant in Midtown Sacramento. Just 18 months ago, he'd been washing other people's cars, desperate and on the verge of crossing a moral line that would have changed his life in very different ways. "Chef, the new delivery of produce is here," Marco announced, "and Emma just called. She's running 10 minutes late for her shift but said not to worry." Frank smiled at the mention of her name. "Thanks. Can you handle the line for a few minutes? I need to check on something." Stepping out of the kitchen into the dining area, Frank surveyed their creation with quiet pride. The restaurant was modestly sized, just 15 tables, but every detail reflected careful thought. Warm wood tones complemented cool blue accents, creating an atmosphere that was both sophisticated and welcoming. Local artwork adorned the walls, each piece selected by Emma for how it captured the spirit of cultural fusion that defined their menu. Near the entrance, a framed article from the Sacramento Bee hung prominently. From car wash to culinary sensation, local chef's unlikely journey. The piece had been written 3 months after they'd opened, when word of mouth had transformed their little restaurant from a risky venture to a local hotspot, with weekend reservations booked weeks in advance. Frank checked his watch and headed to the small office at the back of the restaurant. Inside, a child-sized desk was set up in the corner, where Gabe was focused intently on his homework. At 6, now in first grade, his son had grown taller and stronger. The improvement in his condition over the past year had been remarkable. "How's it going, buddy?" Frank asked, ruffling Gabe's hair. Gabe looked up with a grin that showcased a missing front tooth. "Great. I'm almost done with my math. Then Emma said she'd help me practice my reading when she gets here." "Sounds good. Need any help with the math?" Gabe shook his head confidently. "Nope. Emma showed me a trick for adding big numbers. It's easy now." Frank smiled at the casual way his son mentioned Emma, as if she had always been part of their lives, as if the extraordinary circumstances that had brought her into their world were the most natural thing in the world. A knock at the office door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Wilson stood there, her silver hair now styled in a fashionable bob, dressed in black slacks and a crisp white shirt, the uniform of the restaurant's host staff. "Your regular Thursday couple is here," she reported. "The Johnsons. They're asking for the table by the window." "Thanks, Grace," Frank replied, using her first name as she had insisted once she had become an employee rather than just a neighbor. "Make sure they get the wine they like." Mrs. Wilson, Grace, nodded knowingly. "Already told Marco to decant a bottle of the Pinot they prefer." She glanced at Gabe. "And how's our young scholar today?" "I got 100 on my spelling test," Gabe announced proudly. "Excellent. I knew all that practice would pay off." Grace beamed at him before turning back to Frank. "Oh, and Dr. Rivera called to confirm Gabe's appointment next week. I told her you'd call back tomorrow to verify the time." Frank nodded gratefully. When the restaurant had first opened, Grace had insisted on coming aboard as their host and unofficial manager. Her organizational skills had proven invaluable, bringing order to what could have been chaos for 2 novice restaurateurs. Now she worked just 4 shifts a week, claiming it kept her young and useful, though Frank suspected she simply enjoyed being part of their extended family. "I should get back to the kitchen," Frank said. "Gabe, you good here for a bit longer?" "Yep." Gabe was already turning back to his homework. Frank returned to the kitchen just as the back door opened, and Emma walked in, cheeks flushed from the brisk October air. Her blonde hair, now grown back to shoulder length, was pulled into a neat ponytail, and she wore a light blue dress under her chef's coat. "Sorry I'm late," she said, quickly washing her hands at the sink. "The oncologist had a last-minute opening, so I took it." "All clear again. That's 3 clean scans in a row." Frank paused in his cooking, the relief washing over him anew even though they'd been expecting good news. He pulled her into a quick hug, mindful of the busy kitchen. "That's fantastic. We'll celebrate tonight." Emma squeezed him back before donning her apron and seamlessly joining the workflow, taking over the dessert station that had become her domain. The transformation in her over the past year had been nothing short of miraculous. From the skeletal woman he'd found abandoned and near death, to the vibrant, creative force beside him now. The selling of her family jewels had indeed solved both their immediate problems. A trusted jeweler referred by one of Grace's friends had given them a fair price that had secured Gabe's medication for a full year and funded Emma's treatment through a specialized program for uninsured patients. The remainder had been enough for a modest down payment on the restaurant space when it unexpectedly came on the market 6 months later. By then, Emma had regained her strength through proper nutrition and completed her chemotherapy. She'd also discovered a passion for baking during her recovery, experimenting first with simple recipes that would tempt Gabe's sometimes picky appetite, then moving on to more sophisticated desserts that incorporated Dutch techniques with California ingredients. Their partnership had evolved organically, friendship deepening into something more as they built a new life together. Frank's culinary talents, dormant for years, had flourished under Emma's encouragement. Her business acumen, honed during her years teaching executives, had proven essential in transforming his passion into a viable business. The dinner service progressed smoothly, the kitchen finding its rhythm as orders came in steadily. At 8 o'clock, Frank took a short break to visit the couple at table 9 as promised, regular customers celebrating their anniversary. Everything was delicious as always, the wife enthused, especially the new dessert. "Is that cardamom in the apple tart?" Frank smiled. "Emma's secret ingredient. She'll be thrilled you noticed." "You two make quite the team," the husband observed. "It's rare to see two chefs work together so harmoniously." "We balance each other out," Frank replied simply. Returning to the kitchen, he found Emma helping Gabe with his reading at the small break table in the corner, her dessert orders temporarily caught up. They made a picture-perfect scene, heads bent together over a book, Emma patiently helping Gabe sound out a difficult word. Frank felt the now familiar tightness in his chest, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief at how profoundly his life had changed. "Sound it out," Emma was saying. "Extraordinary. Extraordinary," Gabe repeated carefully. "Extraordinary. That means really, really special, right?" "Exactly right," Emma confirmed, meeting Frank's gaze over Gabe's head with a smile that still made his heart skip. The rest of the evening passed in the controlled chaos of a successful restaurant. By 11, they had served their last customers, completed cleanup and were heading home, not to Frank's old apartment, but to a modest 3-bedroom house they'd begun renting 4 months earlier. The short commute was filled with comfortable conversation about the day's events, plans for tomorrow's specials, and Gabe's excited chatter about his upcoming field trip to the Science Museum. At home, while Emma tucked Gabe into bed, Frank checked their mailbox, sorting through the usual mix of bills, advertisements, and restaurant-related correspondence. A thick, cream-colored envelope caught his attention, the return address showing a law firm in downtown Sacramento. Inside, he found formal documentation and a letter on heavy letterhead. "Dear Ms. Vandermeer, we are pleased to inform you that your divorce from Mr. Lucas Hargrove has been finalized as of October 15th. As per the court's decision, the division of assets has been completed according to the terms outlined in the enclosed documents. Additionally, we have received confirmation that Mr. Hargrove will remain in custody pending his trial for insurance fraud and elder financial abuse charges. As discussed, the prosecution has requested your testimony, but understands your reluctance to appear in person. Written testimony remains an option should you prefer. The deed to the River Park property has been transferred solely to your name, as ordered by the court, due to Mr. Hargrove's documented abandonment and the property having been purchased primarily with your inheritance funds. Should you have any questions or require further assistance, please do not hesitate to contact our office. Sincerely, Margaret Chen, Esker." Frank stared at the letter, particularly the mention of the River Park house. Emma had never wanted to return there, the memories too painful. They'd assumed Lucas had sold it or lost it, when his schemes had finally caught up with him 6 months ago. The discovery that Emma now owned it outright would be significant news. "What's that?" Emma asked, coming into the kitchen after finishing Gabe's bedtime routine. Frank handed her the letter. "Your divorce is final, and apparently you own the house." Emma read quickly, her expression shifting from surprise to thoughtfulness. "I never thought I'd get the house back. Lucas always made it seem like it was entirely his." "What will you do with it?" Frank asked carefully. They had discussed marriage recently, a step both wanted but had put off until Emma's legal ties to Lucas were severed. The house represented significant financial security, but also held painful memories. Emma set the letter down and moved to embrace him. "Sell it," she said definitively. "That house was never a home." "This is home." She gestured around them at the modest rental with its mismatched furniture and walls covered in Gabe's artwork. "Besides, I have plans for that money." "Oh?" Frank raised an eyebrow. Emma smiled mysteriously. "Let's just say I've been looking into commercial real estate. The space next to the restaurant is coming available. I'm thinking bakery by day, dessert, bar by night." Frank laughed, lifting her off her feet in a gentle spin. "Always the entrepreneur. Says the man who went from car washer to celebrated chef in under a year," she teased back. Later, as they lay in bed together, Emma's head resting on his shoulder, Frank reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had led them here. Had he not been desperate enough to attempt burglary that night? Had Emma not called out for help? Had he chosen to leave rather than stay? "Penny for your thoughts?" Emma murmured sleepily. "Just thinking about coincidences," Frank replied. "Or fate, maybe." Emma nestled closer. "When I was at my lowest point, abandoned and waiting to die, I prayed for a miracle. Instead, I got a burglar." Her voice held no judgment, only warmth. "Turns out that was exactly the miracle I needed." Frank pressed a kiss to her forehead. "We saved each other. And now we save others," Emma added, "with food instead of medicine." It was true. Beyond their personal success, they had made giving back a cornerstone of their business. Once a month, they closed the restaurant to regular customers and opened exclusively to families dealing with chronic illness, offering a free night of normalcy and excellent food. They worked with the same medical assistance program that had helped Emma, donating a percentage of profits to fund treatments for those without insurance. The journey hadn't been without challenges. Lucas had briefly caused trouble when he'd returned from Lake Tahoe to find Emma gone, filing a missing persons report that had led to uncomfortable questions. But his own criminal activities, using Emma's illness to solicit fraudulent donations and defrauding elderly clients through investment schemes, had quickly become the focus of police attention instead. As Emma's breathing deepened into sleep, Frank gently stroked her hair, marveling at how close they'd both come to very different outcomes. His desperate plan that night could have led to arrest, separation from Gabe, a ruined life. Instead, it had led to redemption, love, and a second chance he'd never imagined possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, restaurant orders to manage, Gabe's doctor appointment to confirm, decisions about the house to discuss. But for now, in the quiet darkness, with Emma sleeping peacefully beside him and Gabe secure in the next room, Frank allowed himself to feel something he'd nearly forgotten. Hope. Not just for survival, but for a future filled with possibilities as extraordinary as the path that had brought them together. 3 months later, the sold sign in front of the River Park house swayed slightly in the January breeze as Emma stood on the sidewalk, keys in hand. She hadn't been back since that fateful night when Frank had found her abandoned and dying. Now, on the day of closing, she had asked Frank to accompany her for one final walkthrough before handing the keys to the new owners. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Frank asked, his arm protective around her shoulders. "The realtor said we don't have to be here." Emma took a deep breath and nodded. "I need the closure. To walk out on my own terms this time." They made their way up the stone path to the front door. Emma's hand trembled slightly as she inserted the key, memories flooding back as the door swung open. The house had been professionally cleaned and staged for selling, all traces of her previous life with Lucas erased. Without the personal touches, it felt like a model home, beautiful but soulless. "It looks so different," she murmured, stepping into the entryway. The furniture was gone, replaced by tasteful staging pieces that held no emotional significance. Frank remained silent, allowing Emma to process the moment in her own way. They moved through the downstairs rooms slowly, Emma occasionally pausing to touch a wall or look out a window. In the kitchen, she stopped and let out a small laugh. "This is where you made me soup that night," she said, gesturing to the now empty space where the stove had been. "I hadn't eaten in days. I thought I was hallucinating when I heard someone downstairs." Frank smiled at the memory. "I was terrified, both of getting caught breaking in and of what to do with the dying woman I'd found." "Some burglar you were," Emma teased gently, the humor they'd developed about their unusual meeting softening the edges of the difficult memories. They made their way upstairs, pausing at the master bedroom doorway. Emma hesitated, then squared her shoulders and walked in. The room that had been her prison during those last days with Lucas was now just an empty space, sunlight streaming through open curtains. "I never thought I'd leave this room alive," she said quietly. "I remember staring at that water glass, unable to reach it. Then you appeared like something from a dream." Frank pulled her close. "Let's focus on how far you've come, not how low things were." Emma nodded, taking one last look around before turning toward the door. "I'm ready to go. There's nothing for me here anymore." As they descended the stairs, a car pulled into the driveway. Through the front windows, they could see their realtor, Judith, stepping out along with a well-dressed couple. That must be the buyers, Emma said. They're early. Judith had told them the house had been purchased by a doctor and her husband, who had fallen in love with the property and paid above asking price. Emma had been pleased to know it would become a true home again. They met the couple at the front door, Dr. Sarah Patel and her husband Raj. Emma immediately recognized the name. Dr. Patel? Are you by chance an oncologist at Sacramento Memorial? The elegant woman smiled in surprise. Yes, I am. Have we met before? You were my doctor, Emma explained, during my breast cancer treatment. I was Emma Vandermeer then. Recognition dawned in the doctor's eyes. Emma, of course. You missed appointments and then we heard you had moved away for treatment. She studied Emma's face with professional assessment. You look wonderful. I take it your treatment was successful. Very, Emma confirmed. I've been in remission for over a year now. And you used to live here? Dr. Patel asked, putting the pieces together. Emma nodded. Yes, with my ex-husband. It's a beautiful home. I hope you'll be very happy here. As the two couples chatted, Emma learned that Dr. Patel planned to use one of the bedrooms as a home office, where she could review cases without staying late at the hospital. Her husband, a software engineer who worked remotely, was excited about converting another bedroom into a home gym. We've been looking for a place where we could really put down roots, Dr. Patel explained. Maybe start a family soon. This is definitely a house that deserves a family, Emma said warmly. It's meant to be filled with life. After completing the final paperwork and handing over the keys, Emma and Frank walked hand in hand back to their car. Emma paused at the end of the driveway, turning for one last look. I never expected to feel this way, she admitted, but I'm actually happy the house is going to them, especially to Dr. Patel. She was always kind to me, even when I stopped showing up for appointments. Frank squeezed her hand. Ready for the next chapter? More than ready, Emma replied, her smile genuine as she turned her back on the past. The proceeds from the house sale, nearly $950,000 after paying off the remaining mortgage, had already been allocated. Part would go toward purchasing the commercial space next to their restaurant, transforming Emma's dream of a dessert bar into reality. Another portion would establish a foundation to help families dealing with chronic illness afford treatments not covered by insurance. The rest would secure their future together, a college fund for Gabe, a down payment on a house they would choose together, a safety net none of them had ever known before. As they drove across town to the restaurant where Grace was watching Gabe, Emma absently twisted the engagement ring on her finger. Frank had proposed on Christmas Eve, presenting her with a simple but elegant diamond in a setting that incorporated small blue sapphires that matched her eyes. "Penny for your thoughts?" Frank asked, echoing the phrase that had become their shorthand for checking in with each other during moments of reflection. "I was just thinking about how differently things could have turned out," Emma replied. "If you hadn't decided to break into that particular house on that particular night, if you hadn't called out for help," Frank continued, "if I hadn't kept my grandmother's jewelry, if Mrs. Wilson hadn't been a retired nurse." They had played this game before, tracing the unlikely chain of events that had saved them both. What had once felt like the lowest points of their lives had been transformed into the foundation of something beautiful. "Did I tell you Lucas sent another letter?" Emma said, changing the subject. Frank's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "No. What did he want this time?" "The usual. Forgiveness, character reference for his sentencing, claims he's a changed man." Emma shook her head. "I don't hate him anymore. I just don't care." The prison facility where Lucas was serving his 5-year sentence for fraud was only an hour away, but it might as well have been on another planet for all Emma thought about him now. "Dr. Rivera called about Gabe's latest results while you were meeting with the bakery contractor," Frank said, deliberately steering the conversation toward happier topics. "The new medication protocol is working even better than expected. She thinks we might be able to reduce the dosage again next month." Emma's face lit up. "That's fantastic news. We should celebrate tonight." "Already planned," Frank replied with a smile. "I asked Marco to prepare Gabe's favorite mac and cheese with the fancy truffle oil he loves, and Grace is bringing that chocolate cake you taught her to make." They pulled into the parking lot behind their restaurant. The Frank's Fusion Kitchen sign glowed warmly in the winter afternoon, the smaller Coming Soon Emma's Sweet Spot sign next door, a promise of future expansion. Inside, they found Gabe at his usual table in the corner, intently focused on a drawing while Grace prepared table settings for the evening service. "Mom, Dad," Gabe called out when he spotted them, rushing over for hugs. The mom still felt new and precious to Emma. Gabe had started using it spontaneously after Frank had proposed, declaring that since they were going to be a real family, he wanted to call Emma his mom. "What are you drawing, buddy?" Frank asked, examining the colorful artwork. "Our family," Gabe explained, pointing to the figures. "There's you and Mom and me and Grace and Marco and Lily and even Dr. Rivera." Emma smiled at the extended family portrait. "It's beautiful. We should frame it and hang it in the restaurant. Can we put it next to the other one?" Gabe asked eagerly, referring to the first drawing of their family that hung prominently near the host stand, a crayon masterpiece depicting Frank, Emma, and Gabe standing in front of a building labeled Restauranti. "Absolutely," Frank assured him. Prime real estate. As the staff began arriving for dinner service, Frank and Emma fell into their usual pre-opening routine, checking reservations, reviewing specials, ensuring everything was in place for another successful evening. The easy synchronicity of their movements reflected their deepening partnership, personal and professional. Later that night, after a busy service, an impromptu celebration of Gabe's medical news, and putting an excited child to bed, Frank and Emma sat on the porch swing of their rental home, a blanket draped across their laps against the January chill. "I've been thinking," Emma said, her head resting on Frank's shoulder, "about the restaurant name." "What about it?" "When we open the dessert bar, maybe we should consider rebranding both businesses under one name. Something that reflects both of us." Frank considered this. "What did you have in mind?" "Second Chance," Emma suggested. "Second Chance Kitchen and Second Chance Sweets." Frank smiled in the darkness. "I like it. It's what we both got, after all. And what we try to give to others," Emma added, thinking of their monthly dinners for families battling illness, the foundation they were establishing, the jobs they provided to people needing fresh starts. They sat in comfortable silence, the gentle creaking of the swing the only sound. In the distance, Sacramento's city lights twinkled, a reminder of how far they'd come from those desperate days of just trying to survive. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked suddenly. "Breaking into my house that night, all the complications that followed." Frank turned to look at her, his expression serious in the dim porch light. "Not for a single moment." He touched her cheek gently. "Best failed burglary of my life," Emma laughed softly, "and the best rescue of mine." She leaned in to kiss him, still marveling at how the worst night of her life had ultimately led to such unexpected joy. Inside, Gabe slept peacefully, his health improving steadily. The cabinet that had once been nearly empty of his medication now held a 6-month supply, with the security of knowing they could afford refills. The restaurant thrived, their new venture was taking shape, and the future stretched before them with possibilities neither had dared to imagine in their darkest moments. As they finally went inside, arm in arm, Emma thought about Dr. Patel and her husband, starting their new life in the house where she had nearly ended hers. There was symmetry in that transition, a place of abandonment becoming a place of new beginnings. Just as she and Frank had transformed their lowest moments into the foundation of something beautiful. Their unusual love story had begun with a desperate act, born of a father's love for his suffering child and a woman's call for help when all hope seemed lost. It had continued through healing and growth, shared dreams and second chances. And now, as they stood on the threshold of their home, the true home they had built together through love rather than mere architecture, Emma knew that the most extraordinary chapters of their story were still waiting to be written. The next morning, as sunshine streamed through the kitchen windows, Frank prepared breakfast while Emma helped Gabe pack his backpack for school. The ordinary domestic scene was anything but ordinary to them, each moment together a gift neither had expected to receive. "Don't forget, we're meeting with the contractor at 4 to finalize the dessert bar plans," Emma reminded Frank as she poured coffee. "Got it on my calendar," he confirmed, flipping a perfect pancake with the skill of someone born to cook rather than wash cars. "Marco's handling prep today so we can both be there." "And I'm coming too," Gabe announced, proud to be included in the family business decisions. Emma smiled, ruffling his hair. "Of course you are. We need our official taste tester." As they sat down to breakfast together, Emma looked at Frank and Gabe, her unlikely family found in the most desperate of circumstances, and felt a completeness she had never known possible. Their story had begun with an attempted burglary and a plea for help, but it had become something far richer, a testament to the healing power of compassion, the strength found in vulnerability, and love's ability to transform even the darkest moments into pathways toward light. "What are you thinking about, Mom?" Gabe asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Emma smiled, reaching out to take both Gabe's and Frank's hands. "Just how lucky I am to have found you both." "Actually," Frank corrected gently, "I think we found each other, exactly when we needed to." And in that simple truth lay the heart of their extraordinary journey. Two broken people who had saved each other and, in doing so, created a family bound not by blood but by something equally powerful: the choice to see beyond circumstance, to offer help when it would have been easier to turn away, and to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of their former lives. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Frank and Emma has touched your hearts. Their journey reminds us that sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our darkest moments, and that compassion can transform lives in unexpected ways. If you enjoyed this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories that explore the resilience of the human spirit. Find it by clicking on the link to your left. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring unique stories that explore life's complexities and the healing power of connection. Don't miss our upcoming content, and please share your thoughts in the comments below. We can't wait to bring you another unforgettable story tomorrow.